welcome to another episode of Curiosities in Psychology. So today I'm joined by Tash. Tash is currently doing her Masters in Clinical Psychology at the University of Tasmania. So thank you for being here today, Tash.
Hey, Lexi.
So we're going to talk generally about mental health, stereotypes around mental health conditions, and also stereotypes around seeing a psychologist too. But I want to start just by asking, what was it that made you decide to study psychology? And what was your knowledge on mental health before you started studying psych?
So I've always sort of had a bit of an interest in it growing up and stuff. I never really studied it in college or anything like that. And then fortunate enough to get a job in community mental health, just doing like administrative roles and things like that. And I ended up landing in a community like mental health inpatient unit. And that was just so interesting. So I just loved every second of it. And I was working with such a great team. They were all like super educated, super smart people. They were all super passionate about what they were doing. So it kind of just lit a fire in my belly, really. And I was like, well, I'm going to go study psych. And here I am 5 years later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So do you think you had a good understanding of kind of mental health conditions and things before you started?
I would say generally, yes, not too bad. Like as far as like, you know, the extra stuff like diagnostic things and stuff like that, definitely not. But as far as being aware of the more general stuff like your depression, your anxiety, those kinds of things, I had a pretty good understanding just based on some lived experience with some friends and stuff like that. But I definitely had no idea about like the brain function and structure and all of that stuff, which really plays into it, which has been hugely like mind-blowing learning all of that stuff.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I think when we come out of uni, we kind of often, I think everyone who goes through uni like comes out thinking, what did I actually learn? Like, what was the point of that? But then when you actually think about it, it's like, oh, okay, I do actually know quite a bit about it now.
And I've had some really interesting times where I've been like, what have I even learned? And then I'll go and I'll read a paper and I'm like, this makes sense. If I had tried to read this 5 years ago, I would have just been like, what do these words mean?
Exactly. And I think also our understanding of mental health in general, like as a society, has definitely increased in the last few years as well when we've been studying it, which I think is a great thing. But I also think sometimes there's a lot of words these days that are just kind of tossed around, like depression and anxiety and ADHD and OCD. And again, it's great that we are discussing it more and using those words, but I feel like sometimes there's a bit of a kind of lack of understanding about the true meaning of these and how severe these conditions can actually be for people that really are suffering from them. Like often a lot of people, you know, say, oh, I'm OCD. And it's like, yeah, everyone has symptoms of it. Like everyone feels depressed sometimes, feels anxious or feels like they can't concentrate like ADHD. But there's a big difference between actually like having symptoms of the condition and actually having that condition or having that mental health problem. So yeah, it's interesting. I think that's the thing with us, with society these days, that we do have this understanding, but there's still a bit of a lack of understanding about how severe it can be for some people. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that we have more knowledge as a society around mental health?
I think we have more knowledge around some, but there is so much misinformation stuff, especially on like social media. Like my algorithm just like shows me all of this random psych stuff all the time. And then some of it I watch and I'm just like, what? Yeah. Where did that come from? So I think it's kind of, you know, 6 to 1, half a dozen to the other. It's nice that people are talking about it more and, you know, people are, you know, especially with like ADHD and stuff, are able to then go, oh, actually, maybe I have this, and then go and see a professional to actually get their diagnosis and get, you know, some assistance, which is really good. But I don't think there's still a long way to go. Yeah. And especially with like more severe sort of disorders, such as like your psychotic disorders and stuff, there's so much misinformation about those and what those symptoms mean. And, you know, for instance, people can have hallucinations or delusions and not have like a psychotic disorder. Like there's plenty of disorders that have those symptoms. And I just think, there's a bit of misconception about illness and and symptoms and what actually qualifies as a disorder
Yep.
and those kinds of things. Because like you said, everything exists on a bit of a continuum. Like mental illness is a continuum.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think that's true with social media. There is a lot of great stuff out there, but a lot of misconceptions and a lot of stuff that's like, what are you talking about? And I think it's true as well what you said about people, like they can kind of learn about something and think, oh, maybe I can go get diagnosed for that. But I think that's also, like, I've had some friends that have kind of like been struggling a bit, or friends or acquaintances, whoever. And I said, why don't you go see someone? And they're kind of like, well, because everyone has it. Like everyone has depression, anxiety. Everyone else is like fine. Why should I go see someone? Like it's normal. Yes, it's good that we've normalized the fact that we can talk about these mental health conditions, but suffering from one isn't normal.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important distinction to make these days, because yeah, it's great that we're talking about it, but you should still see someone if you need help.
Yeah, it's kind of funny, isn't it? It's like the knowledge has become a bit of a barrier to actually help seeking. It's like great that you understand, you know, that you're struggling, but that also means that, you know, it doesn't mean that someone can't help you to stop struggling. Whereas I think a lot of people are like, oh, well,
Yeah.
like, I've identified what's going on. That's good enough.
Yeah,
Whereas
exactly.
Really, that's not.
Yeah, it's like going to a doctor. Like just because you've got a cold doesn't mean like you won't go to get help. It's like, well, you can go there for medication or to get advice on what to do. It's the same kind of thing with mental health. You might know what you have to an extent, but you might not know how to help yourself. So yeah, seeking help is always a good option.
And it's also pretty interesting too, because there is so much overlap within different disorders that someone might be like, oh, I've got this, but really they don't. It's like another disorder altogether, or they've got comorbid disorders, you know, more than one at a time, and those kinds of things. So I think it's great, but it can also be not great. Yeah. like most things in psych and
in life.
and life.
Yeah, very true. So just to move on from that, what do you think are some harmful stereotypes that we have around mental health and mental health conditions that we might need to change?
I think the main one that I like hear a lot and have experienced like through other people is that somehow a mental illness makes you weak, or seeking help for that mental illness makes you weak. So like I think people have this misconception about the role of like a psychologist and things. They're like, oh, you know, I'm broken or whatever it is they believe about themselves. And they think that, you know, trying to seek help, especially in men, I find this is a lot more, and I have definitely got male friends who have felt this way, and I've been like trying to advocate, like, go and see someone. And I'm like, it's not about being weak, it's about them giving you the tools to be able to cope with, you know, what you're dealing with. And often these are extreme things. Like, you know, we say depression, anxiety is quite common, but depression is like one of the, I think it's the like leading cause of death as far as mental illness goes. Like it's super serious, and these people are like, no, it's fine. Like I don't need help. I don't need this. But and I think we need to really try and communicate that as it's a toolbox that you're building, and it's not just psychologists that helps. You know, we've got social workers, we've got psych nurses, psychiatrists. There's a whole broad range of people that work in the mental health space, and you know, people should be accessing those services. Yeah,
100% agree. It is really true, and it does seem to be more common in men. Same with going to the doctor, I guess. So yeah, the more we can advocate that, the better. But I think also like the language that we use around mental health also makes a big difference to people seeking help, and we'll talk about that a bit more later. But I think also just to add on to that I think a lot of stereotypes come from kind of what's on paper. Like people might read that if you're depressed, that you will be sad all the time and you'll be crying. And it's like, well, not necessarily. Like depression can be a dullness of feeling, or feeling numb, or an absence of feeling sometimes. So there's a lot of symptoms that, can be kind of misrecognized or not known. And that's another reason why people kind of have these stereotypes around mental health and why they don't go seek help.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that, especially with symptoms like, you know, around feeling numb or whatever, and like symptoms around like dissociation and stuff like that. People don't really associate them with, you know, depression or anxiety, but there's some of the major symptoms of those illnesses, and people are like, I just don't feel anything. Like,
Yeah. But I'm fine.
Yeah. So, but I'm fine because they, you know, whereas they have sort of, maybe they have some mood fluctuations, whereas, so that means they might not necessarily meet the criteria for a depressive diagnosis. However, it does mean that there is still capacity for people to help them.
Yeah.
And I think that's another misconception too, is people believe that if they don't have an illness or don't meet the diagnostic criteria for an illness, they can't get any help.
Yeah.
And that's not right.
Yeah.
Especially like as psychologists, our goal is to sort of treat distress. We want to assist people to, you know, live the most healthy and functional life that they can. And whether that means they get a diagnosis or not, you know, that really doesn't matter.
No.
I mean, it obviously does matter, but in regards to seeking help, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's not the end outcome for seeking help. You don't need a diagnosis to know that you're not okay.
Yeah, and people often feel that way. They're like, oh no, but it's not bad enough. Like, I don't need to help because it's not bad enough, but it's you know, it's really, you know, impairing their function, you know, in some way. For instance, with anxiety, like not being able to go out, you know, and hang out with your friends because you have severe social anxiety, or not getting enough sleep because you're busy, you know, ruminating on all the things that are going on in your life. So there's lots of little bits that I don't think people necessarily equate to needing assistance with, when really they could be, I want to say happier, but I don't know if it's the right word. Yeah.
I'm content.
Yeah.
Yeah. 100%. And saying it's not bad enough, that's such a common thing I hear all the time.
Time.
Like, yeah, it's frustrating because it's like, it is. Like whatever you're feeling, like a common thing as well is people saying that, other people have it worse. It's like, that doesn't discount your emotions or your experiences at all. Yes, other people are going through things as well, but so are you. Take yourself into account.
The comparison game is a dangerous one.
Definitely.
Yeah, I don't think any good really comes out of it.
No, it doesn't. But it's so hard not to.
Yeah.
For people to not compare with everyone around them.
And again, back to like the social media thing, a huge problem for mental health is people comparing. You know, not even just a general comparison where like, oh, their life's perfect or whatever, but also, you know, in the mental health space, there's a lot of people sharing their experiences of mental health or mental illness, and then people being like, well, mine was nothing like that, so I can't possibly need help for what's going on for me, because it wasn't anywhere near that bad. So I don't know. Everyone
experiences different things, and it's all valid. I think that's a really important point to make.
It is. All
right, so let's move on to chat about language around mental health conditions. So how do you think that the language we use kind of perpetuates stereotypes around mental health conditions, and how can we kind of use more inclusive language around mental health?
That's a really good question.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I think language around mental health has definitely evolved. You know, even if you just compare like the Gen Xers and the Gen Zs, the way they talk about even just going to see a therapist is entirely different. Like, you know, for someone who, you know, was part of Gen X, it was like shameful and all those kinds of things. It'd be like, oh, I'm seeing a therapist. And then for like, you know, someone like Gen Zs or millennials, we're like, oh yeah, I've been to therapy. Like it's like a green flag for us. We're like, oh, you've been to therapy? Excellent.
Yeah, good job.
Yeah. I think, you know, with language too, it's not necessarily always the words we use, it's the tone. Yeah, so I think tone conveys a lot sort of, you know, within the subtext of how people view things. So, and obviously, you know, language does play a key part as well, your words. So like, you know, derogatory terms or negative terms can really, really impact someone's not only perception of themselves and help seeking, but also, you know, these collectively it impacts the society's sort of view on what mental health is and how to treat it and what it means for you as a person. You know, go back to my example earlier of a psychotic disorder. There is still so much negative stigma around those kinds of things, and it's not necessarily the way we talk about it, but it's like the assumptions that everyone has about those illnesses and what that means for that person. So those kinds of like diagnoses really tend to follow people around.
Yeah, I agree. I think the language we can use is can make a huge difference as well, like you said, to how people feel about themselves. I was chatting to someone about this the other day, like how we talk about certain conditions, like people with schizophrenia. If you say, oh, they're schizophrenic, like it's such a intense label, and it kind of takes away that person's agency. Like if we're talking about physical illnesses, like if someone has cancer, you don't say, oh, you are cancer. You say you have cancer. And it's exactly the same with mental illnesses. If you say you're schizophrenic, instead of saying you have schizophrenia, it sort of makes it seem like that whole person is just that illness or just that condition. And it affects them so much as well, because there's so much more than that. Like, and I think that's a really important thing we don't talk about enough. Like, people are so much more than their condition, and just labeling them as that, it takes away their agency, takes away their own sense of self and sense of personality. And it's funny, I was thinking as well about when I was working at a psych practice a few years ago, like all the referrals that we're getting from doctors will just say, oh, this person has depression and anxiety and blah, blah, blah. And you just kind of imagine them to walk in as this blob of darkness. But it's like, they're not. Like, they're people with all these other experiences and all these other things. So the language that we use around mental health conditions is really crucial to making people feel that they are still a person outside of that condition. I think that's an important thing to know.
Yeah, I totally agree with that 100%, especially with, like around, mental illness more typically. People often, their lives are overtaken by these illnesses, and they often lose a sense of self. So it's really, really important that we try to, as a society, as individuals, as clinicians, really try to demonstrate to these people that they have their own personality and they have their own life, and they are more than what their condition is, because often they feel like that. It's not necessarily because of the way people have spoken to them or things like that. That obviously contributes to it. But their lives are like sometimes immeasurably impacted by these illnesses, and everything shifts for them. It's the same as like a serious chronic illness, and that's essentially what they are. Most mental illnesses will reoccur over the lifespan. So it's about managing those and understanding that the person is, like you said, more outside of that illness. And I think it's really important to try and champion that for people to say you are more than your illness. Yeah.
What are some ways you think we can get people to kind of think about that more, and kind of how can we kind of promote that?
Ooh, interesting. Asking hard questions. A lot of that work is kind of done through therapy and the therapeutic process, which I'm still a baby. I don't know a huge amount about. Talk to me in a couple of years, maybe I'll be like, oh my God, I know all the answers. Maybe, who knows? I don't know if anyone ever
feels like that.
But as far as like individuals and stuff go, I think, say a friend of yours has, depression, and they're really struggling with that. I think it's important to try and reach out to those people and try and treat them as you had prior to knowing about their depression, because I feel like a lot of, not even attitudes, but even unconsciously, we sort of start to tiptoe around people who we're worried about, and begin to treat them differently, which then makes them feel even more like alienated and separated from their sense of self. So I think it's super important to try and just be really true and authentic to the relationship you've always had. And while that stuff does impact it, and it's great to be understanding, and, if your friend is not feeling up to going out, or, for various amount of reasons, don't hold that against them. It is hard to manage relationships where there is mental illness, but I think it's super important to try your best to just keep things like the status quo and not get put out or upset when you do have to make exceptions, because those people need those exceptions. That's like a really supportive thing for you to be able to do for somebody. And then it kind of, especially with like relationships, it means that you know, that person doesn't feel like they're letting down their end of the relationship, because they probably already feel that way anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're already having a lot of negative thoughts about themselves, and about the world around them. And really, I think it's really good to do the best you can to really not contribute any more to those thoughts.
Yeah.
And then if you can, try and correct some of them, you know, even if it's just a little, like a nice compliment here or there, like, oh, you know, I really enjoyed seeing you today, or something like that. Just small little things. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so important, because I 100% agree. I think a lot of people do kind of shy away from talking about it, or pretending that nothing is wrong, because they don't want relationships with people to change. That's such a good point. And not to kind of tiptoe around others and just act like you would normally with them. Like obviously it does make a difference, as you said, because they do have a mental illness or a mental health problem, and that's okay. So normalize talking about that with them. It doesn't have to be like a really, really deep conversation every time. It can just be like, how you going? Feeling a bit shit today? Okay, we'll deal with that. Like, it doesn't have to be, a deep thing, and it doesn't have to be a big thing. Just, you can normalize those discussions and make them feel like they can be around you normally and chat to you about it normally, and it's okay to do that.
Yeah, and I also think in those situations too, you know, you said, oh, I'm having a shit day or whatever, you'd be like, okay, what can we do? How can I help? Yeah. So, you know, we were going to go and do this, but, you know, if you don't feel up to it, do you want to do something else? Would you like to be left alone? Like, how can I help you to feel, you know, or deal with the day that you're having, really?
Yeah.
And then, not having any animosity or anything like that about those situations. And I think that's really hard for people. I think naturally when we're disappointed, it's really hard for us to step out of those feelings, and kind of be mindful of our own emotions and consider, you know, the other person's like perspective, especially when we're having those sort of negative, disappointing, like, or like, oh, they've cancelled on me again kind of feelings, to try and put them in the perspective of why that's happening.
Yeah, for sure. Because as you said before, they're already feeling not good about themselves. Yeah. So you don't want to perpetuate that. That is a really important point to get across as well. It's not a burden for us to know about it. Yeah, and people often do feel like it's a burden. Yeah. And that was an excellent point. It's not about what you're doing or what's happening. It's about spending time with each other, regardless of how that looks. Yeah. Yeah. So let's move on to chatting a little bit about receiving diagnosis. So do you think that it's helpful, or it can be a hindrance, or both? What are your thoughts?
Like everything in psych, it is complicated. Yeah. So sometimes it's great, you know, a diagnosis makes it really easy to communicate with like other services and other mental health professionals, because they go, oh, this person's got this, they need these things. Yeah. But then it can also not be helpful if we give a diagnosis like a psychotic disorder, or a personality disorder or something like that. That will follow that person forever. And so we've been really drilled into at like UTAS about weighing up the benefit and the cost of diagnosing people with an illness, whether or not it's going to benefit them or whether or not it's going to hinder them, and really have like a collaborative approach with the person sitting in front of you, or whether or not they want to. So, you know, you can still treat people for symptoms and you know, manage difficulties and limit distress without giving a diagnosis. So I think, it's very difficult. And then see, for other things such as ADHD, that kind of diagnosis is really good, because you need a diagnosis to access things like medication and services, whereas stuff that is mostly therapeutic based, such as like personality disorders, you know, you don't necessarily need a diagnosis to treat those, because you don't really use medication to treat them. Yeah. Yeah. So I really think it's a case-by-case basis. Yeah. And really is individualized. Yeah. Yeah, it is. And I think, like you said, that it might not be necessary, because you can treat it without necessarily giving a diagnosis. So, yeah, I think it does depend on the person as well. Like, some people I've met, like, really want to be diagnosed because they feel like they have this thing, and they feel like it would be so much easier to explain to people if they do have it. So they want the diagnosis. But yeah, other times people will
get it, and they'll, because of stuff they might have heard about the diagnosis before, they will start to label themselves as something or think that they're this thing that they're not necessarily. So yeah, it can definitely be both, and it does depend, I think.
Yeah, and I think that sort of links back to our early conversation too about people thinking that they are their disorders or their illnesses, when that's not the case.
Yeah.
Which, we know, and hopefully one day everybody will understand, and it'll be magic, perfect world. But yeah. So yeah, I really think you need to weigh up whether it's going to be helpful for this person or it's going to be really unhelpful.
Yeah.
And really, really be quiet, like transparent around that with the person that's sitting with you. Feel like, I think that you may have symptoms of this disorder. Would you like to treat them? Do you want to go through with a formal diagnosis? Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. So what do you think are some common myths or misconceptions around seeing a psychologist?
One of the main ones is that we are just like solution factories. We're here to cure whatever is going on for you. We'll fix it for you. Whereas that's not really what we do. So our goal is to give you the tools to fix it yourself. Essentially teach you how to fix it yourself, because we can't be there, 20, we probably get an hour every few weeks if we're lucky with you. So I really think, trying to teach people how to take care of themselves is the main goal. And people just, they come to me like, just fix it now. And it's like, no, well, that's not really, it's not really possible. And again, like we spoke about earlier, another one is that you have to have an illness to see us, which you definitely don't. It's about distress and, impairment function. And when I say impairment function, I mean like social problems or educational problems or family problems or any kind of difficulty that you're really experiencing that has either changed your life in some way or has like forever been a difficulty for you.
Yeah.
And the last one, which is quite personal to me, is that everyone thinks we're great at stats because we learn so much. But oh my God, they are insane. Yeah. And I know my one of my lecturers, he's one of my favorite lecturers, is always like, oh, I always get things because people are like, oh, you're great at stats. You can understand this. You can do this. And I'm like, God, are people going to do that to me? Oh, we'll see. Yeah. 5 years down in stats and still I'm like, what's going on?
I'm sure you probably know more than you feel though. Yeah, that's very true. Just to go back to what you said before, I also think we should just normalize seeing a psych. Like you go to a doctor to check out your health and you go to a dentist for regular checkups. Like why shouldn't we just normalize going to a psych for a general checkup? I don't know. I think that's just something that...
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've never even thought of that, but that is an excellent idea.
Yeah, and I don't think it should have to be this big deal like, oh, I'm going to book in to see a psych. It's just a thing. You just go do it, chat to them.
Yeah, so if anyone wants to train as a psych, we need you. We're going to conquer the world with psychologists, so the more the merrier.
Yes, we do need a lot more. I think it's like 3 or 4 month wait list at the moment to see a psych in general in most of Tassie.
Yeah.
So
even if you're paying like private practice, it's huge. And like the government cutting back the COVID psych sessions per year, horrific.
Yeah.
So horrific. So we're in crisis. So if anyone wants to come and study for 6 years full time,
only 6 years,
and then do a 2-year registrar program, before you can be like proper qualified.
Do lots of stats.
Come on over. It's not hard at all.
Yeah, we're selling it.
I think it's good though that it is, such a long training course because you learn so much and there is so much to learn. And like you said, we don't know everything. We aren't like cure factories, and we get to be in such a privileged position. Like we get to sit with other people's vulnerability and really try and be there for them. And so I think we have to be really cautious about how we do that. And I forgot where I was going with this point.
Yeah, no, that is a good point though. I was going to say the other day I was chatting to one of the psychs I work with, and I said, what do you enjoy the most about psych? And she said that it's such a privilege being able to hear these things from people that they've never told anyone else. That's really true, because people are their most vulnerable when they're chatting to you. And it's really special, I guess, in a way, to hear that and to be able to try and help them. Yeah,
it totally is. And there's not a huge amount of us. Why there was 300 who started in my cohort in first year, and now there's 8 of us in the clinical psych program in Hobart. So there's not, like, if they're churning out, and they also have like a Masters of Professional Psych now too, which there is about 11 people in that. So I think our cohort's about 19 people in Hobart. That's 19 people a year that they're churning out. That's not much. No.
It's really not.
So
yeah. I guess that's also due to a lack of supervisors in the master program. The whole thing.
Huge. So that's a conversation we could talk about forever.
It's another podcast.
Yeah.
So how do you think stereotypes around mental health affect people going to see a psych, or stops them from going to see a psych?
I think they're a massive barrier to treatment, or to accessing, or just accessing services generally, and not necessarily just psych, but like other services within the mental health space. So, and then, those sort of stereotypes, even once you get people in the door, those people are, they've got a wall up. They're like, I don't believe in this. This is not going to work. All of those kinds of things. And then it gets really difficult to engage them in therapy, or like the therapy process, or any kind of service that you're offering fully, which without engagement, they're not going to get the most benefit. So it can be like really frustrating to really deal with those situations. But, what can we do except continue to talk about it and advocate, for mental health and mental health understanding, and normalizing help seeking and all of those things. Just got to keep fighting the good fight. Really.
Yeah. I think education around it is the most important thing. Like, you can't force anyone to go see a psych, definitely, because you can't, but also if you do and they go, they're not going to be open-minded. So it's not going to work, because they're not going to be willing to change. That is a big barrier, which is very tricky, because you can't change it. It's up to the individual themselves. So
and I think it's not necessarily like individual stereotypes. It's more societal perception more broadly of mental health and help seeking and those kinds of things, which is beginning to change as we move through the generations and have more access to knowledge and all of those kinds of things. But long way to go. And a lot of people to reach that people still haven't reached. So I feel like a lot of people who can access or want to access psych services and things like that, they're usually educated people. They're usually emotionally aware in some kind of way, or like able to identify that what's going on for them isn't necessarily functional or healthy, whereas there's a huge populations that can't identify those things. So we're missing those people. So I'm not sure what the solution is, but one day it'd be nice to again live in a magical land where everyone has equal access to everything, and people can identify when they need assistance and are happy to seek that assistance. But for now, we're just doing the best we can.
That's all we can do.
And I think advocacy is really the only way we can really make change, whether that's advocating for yourself or your friends, advocating in your organisations, or advocating to your politicians, at an organisational level, at a like policy level, like include these things. It's really something that feels like we have to start from the bottom and build up, as opposed to something we can change from the top and it'll trickle down.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I'm hoping to do a podcast as well on mental health in organisations, and I did OrgPsych Adelaide Uni last year, and I remember one of the lecturers talking about that, kind of saying that whole Band-Aid effect that, you know, people go through all this trauma, especially in first assistant services like police or ambulance or whatever, and they will go through all this trauma, and one of the ways they kind of put in place to increase their mental health was to give them like food in the staff room. It's like, great. That's not fixing all this trauma. So it's that kind of Band-Aid effect, whereas we need to actually go back to the very start and say, okay, we need to give them more education around trauma and seeking help, and there's a lot more we can do to build that up.
Yeah, definitely. And especially in those sort of like emergency services or first response services and things like that, people don't ask for help until it is critical, like until they literally can't put one foot in front of the other. You know, I think paramedics have one of the highest rates of suicides of any profession, which is wild. These people have dedicated their lives to helping people, and yet there is some barrier for them being able to help themselves and seek help when they really need it until it's too late. So yeah, I think that's another big topic.
That is, that is another podcast. So I've got some things that I wrote down, common things I often hear people say as a reason they don't want to see a psych. So I want to hear your response to some of these. So the first one is, I know what a psych will tell me. What's your response to that?
Do you though? We don't even know what we're going to say to you, so how could you know? So I think there is a misconception around all psychs being exactly the same, and we're like have to follow this structured script and whatnot. But yeah, that really goes back to taking the individual out of it again, because anything that we say or suggest or try to understand, we have to try and frame it from that individual's perspective. And there's, you know, so much involved in any individual. Like you said earlier, people will often leave a session and be like, that didn't help me, like the first or second session. And in those sessions, all we're trying to do is get to know the individual. So we do this thing called an intake interview, where we just get all the information we can, and people are like, why is that relevant? And it's like, some of it might not be relevant, but some of it might really be contributing to what's going on for you, and seeing how it fits into your life in the more broad context. So I think, how do you know what we're going to say when we don't know? Especially like with psychs, we do so much training, and we do continual training the whole time. You know, when I finish my master's next year, I'm going to be tenfold better than I am, you know, with my knowledge and my understanding and my capacity to help people. And then in 5 years' time, I'm going to be even better. So I think it really develops over time. And, you know, it's an ongoing forever training, essentially. Like, we're forever growing and developing and learning. And I think it's almost a bit unfair for people to say, oh, I know what they're going to say. It kind of disregards the hard work that psychologists put in to get where they are, to be in that privileged position. It kind of disregards that a little. So,
ouch.
Yeah.
Another one is, I've had people say that, oh, I had a friend who went to the psych. They said it was really terrible, so I don't want to go. And I think the thing with that one is, like you were sort of going to before, was that everyone's different. Like, not all psychs are the same, as with any profession. So just because someone went to a psych, maybe they didn't get along with them because of their personality. Like, of course there's going to be clashes. So you do have to find someone who fits you well, and who's right for you. And one psych's approach may not fit you, but it might fit someone else. So I think that's important to keep in mind. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. Especially, you know, not only with like personalities and things, you know, people it's almost like they think we're going to be a little cookie cutter set of psychs coming out of school going in. But my cohort is vastly different. Granted, we are basically all women. Outside of that, vastly different people with vastly different experiences, and we resonate with different types of therapeutic approaches and stuff like that. And so I think that is also, as well as personality, the type of therapy that person prefers to deal with, and their experience, their professional competency really comes into play. And while I can understand having a terrible experience and it leaves a really bad taste in your mouth, I would love for people to persist. And it's the same as if you go to a doctor. You know, I've been to a bunch of doctors in my time. I have endometriosis. It took me 8 years to get diagnosed. Saw a bunch of doctors that just like, nah, terrible doctors, totally disregarded my experience. You know, it's all in your head. You're being dramatic, all of those kinds of things. And then, you know, persist, and now I've got a great doctor who is totally amazing and all those things. And I think the same thing applies for psych. And it is really challenging to persist, especially when, you know, you're experiencing mental illness because, you know, it impairs your functioning so hard. But, you know, if you have the capacity to, I would really encourage people to keep trying until they find the right fit. And a lot of psychologists and stuff have their information sort of online, and they talk about, you know, who they are, what they enjoy treating, what their specialized areas are. So for instance, like at the moment we're studying in school like cognitive behavioral therapy, and that doesn't really resonate with me as a therapist, or as a training therapist, I should say. But, you know, in the future I'd probably use another thing like acceptance and commitment therapy or stuff like that, because I find that more appealing to the way I think and behave and things like that. So it's also about trying to find someone who thinks similarly to you and all of those kinds of things. So
exactly.
So individualized.
Yeah. That's a great example with you trying to find a good doctor as well.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good idea as well, to go through and just like read people's profiles. And if you don't feel up to it, do it with a friend. Get someone to come sit with you, go through them all, and find someone who you think will suit you best.
Ask for help from everybody. Whoever will give it to you, ask for help. Especially, you know, in the mental health space, when just like a little task like Googling some doctors on the internet might just feel super overwhelming, and not like just completely out of your capacity. You know, ask for help if you can. It goes back to earlier I was saying, you know, it's not a burden, you know, to help your friends or your anyone you've got a good relationship with, your colleagues, whoever, when they are struggling. You know, it's a very human thing to want to help people. And, you know, we often get like gratification and reward from that ourselves. We don't, you know, I don't think I've ever helped someone and begrudged helping them. So
yeah, exactly. So how do you think in general that individuals or institutions or communities can kind of work together to overcome these challenging stereotypes and promote mental health in a more healthy way?
Again, huge question. I feel like we could talk about this question for a whole podcast. But I'll keep it a little simple. But like we spoke about earlier, for me, I feel like it's about advocacy. So, you know, individual advocates, organizational advocates, societal advocates, you know, policies, political leaders, all of those kinds of things. We need these like advocates to be informed, and we need these people to, you know, be spreading the actual realities of mental health and illness, and really trying to grow the general population's knowledge of these things, like these illnesses and disorders and things like that. And I also think it would be super important for advocates to focus on how people who are unaffected by or living with people or have good relationships with people with mental illness, how they can support them individually, you know, how they can really help those people get around the challenges that they're experiencing. You know, for example, I have a good friend who's currently going through the process of trying to get diagnosed with ADHD, and they've had a really difficult time sort of emotionally realizing what sort of happened throughout their life, and so many things have clicked into place for them. But again, because we're in Tasmania, it's a long wait. But, you know, part of ADHD is sort of like this executive sort of dysfunction or dysregulation, where they, you know, out of sight, out of mind, or, you know, they have difficulty initiating tasks or doing things. So, you know, I booked an appointment with the GP in the first instance for this person because I'd asked them several times before if they'd booked them and they hadn't yet. And then I said, oh, would you like me to book one for you? Like, would that be helpful? And so I just went online and found them a doctor and booked it. And then the day of, I made sure that we like did something beforehand. So I was like, let's meet for coffee and breakfast in the morning, and then you can walk to your doctor's appointment afterwards. Which wasn't a huge thing. Like for me, it was, you know, I mean, something we would do normally anyway. We'd meet for coffee and breakfast often. But for them, it was like, oh, thank you. Like, you've got the ball rolling. You know, there's something actually happening now. You know, maybe I now have the capacity to continue with this. So yeah, I think it's really about advocacy, about understanding, and advocacy about how we can support each other through these, you know, disorders and illnesses.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Tash. I've just got one final question before we head off. What is your favourite fact about psychology?
That's a good little question too. I loved all your questions today. I've had a really fun time. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
I'm quite interested in like the neuroscience sort of based stuff and the neuropsychology based stuff, and hopefully in the future I'm gonna retrain, and that's where I'll head into.
Great.
Well, it depends. I might stumble upon something that I love more in the next couple of years while I'm practicing.
Who knows?
But for me, I think specifically relating to like PTSD, which is currently like, you know, PTSD and complex PTSD currently going through a bit of an overhaul in our understanding and our diagnosis of and everything as a profession. But for me, I think the most interesting fact about PTSD is that it physically changes the structure of someone's brain. So the way that your like neurotransmitters and things work in the amygdala, which is like your fear center, completely different. Post PTSD, like it physically changes your brain, which is completely wild.
It is.
So it's like the structure and the function changes. Crazy.
It
don't
is.
really understand how that happens yet, or I don't really know if they do. I haven't really read into it too much, but that's just something that I have thought about a fair bit, and I'm just like, wow, that's just wild.
It is. It's great.
Yeah.
That's a great fact. Thank you so much for sharing that. And again, thank you for coming on today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I've had a fab time.